So Andreas is amazing. And his family, he was born and raised in the Netherlands, right? And some of, there we go, yeah, I'm back on track. Some of his heritage is from South America. And he comes to us with stories in relation to fatherhood, as how his father impacted him, and different concepts of self-worth and how that transcended into different areas of his life, and how he's been able to come up against that to shape his life and the lives of other people in a really beautiful way as he's confronted things. And he is a coach and does deliberate breakthroughs with people and living life deliberately in his movement. So he's just a wonderful human being, and I'm so grateful that he's here with us today. So Andreas, please take the stage and tell us more about your wonderful self.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction and your kind words, Alicia. First of all, I want to acknowledge Greg for the story that you told, the framework that you put together. Really, I wish that that information was known with a person who fathered me. I'll speak more about that. And it's a powerful, you're touching on some pain points of my past in a very beautiful way that I intended to speak to. So it's such a beautiful way. And I think you wanted to say something, Craig.
Well, I was going to say that, it's approaching midnight here, so I'm going to have to leave, but I'm going to pick up the recording of what you want to say, because I really, really, really do want to hear that. So if you please forgive me and excuse me, it's very late here. But I'm going to definitely pick up the recording because I really want to hear what you have to say. So thank you so much.
So glad you were here.
Thank you, Craig.
Thanks so much, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.
Take care.
All right. Andreas.
So Alicia introduced me. I'm originally from the Netherlands. Both my parents are from Chile. If we go even further back, my grandmother, so my mom's mom, was born in Chile from a Dutch father and a Spanish mother. And I am living in Chicago. So I'm fourth generation immigrant, because for 4 generations, my family had babies in a different country than where they were born. And when I was preparing for this conversation, I set an intention, and my intention is to get naked. Don't worry, I'm going to keep my clothes on. I'm going to get emotionally naked with you guys. I'm going to share, I don't have any tattoos, so there's no cool stories there, but there are scars, and I can show, obviously, these beautiful parts of my body that are all intact, but there's not much to tell there, but the scars are. There's a story there. And so with that, I'm going to preface it that there's going to be some traumatic things that I'm going to share. So just want to put that for context. I'll give you a heads up. I know that sometimes you just may not be in the mood. Feel free to walk away if you're watching the recording, or even if you're like, okay, I'm not in the mood today for traumatic stories. Just want to give you that heads up. Also know that this is a story of hope. Right? So I'll take you through my story. I'll take you through the depths of my story, but I'll also take you to the other side. So bear with me as we go through this. With that, I'm going to start like right now, trigger alert, right? So we'll dive right in. And that is, I was born in the Netherlands, like I said earlier. I grew up in a very loving family with a mom and a dad and siblings. But my dad was not my biological father. My dad is not my biological father. He's still alive. He earned the title dad. He's a phenomenal dad, but not my biological father. My biological father considered me and my sister a problem, not his problem. And I was 2 years old when he tried to drown me in the bathtub. And I actually remember that. I have memories being in the bathtub, and we can go woo-woo or not. This is my memory. And that is, I remember that image of a lifeless body of a young kid in the bathtub. So I remember that from a weird perspective from above. And I have had that memory since as long as I can remember. Here's the thing. This part of the story, if I would have to summarize it in one phrase, it's that nothing has meaning until we give it meaning. And what I made that experience to mean was that I wasn't worthy. So as a young kid, I did not take up space. I practiced Zen Buddhism, and my Zen teacher in the Netherlands gave me this phrase, and he's like, everyone can be a king or a queen on their own square meter. And for us in the United States, everybody can be a king or a queen on your own 3 square feet. It has less of a ring to it when you say it that way, right? So I like this, the square meter. And as a young kid, I didn't take up my square meter. I took up maybe half a square meter, and nature doesn't like a vacuum. So it gets filled by people, and those are people who bullied me, so I did not have a very fun childhood, despite the fact that I grew up in this very loving household, right? And I've got my notes here. Let me take a quick look. My experience of not, well, let me tell you a little bit more. My biological father considered me a problem, not his problem, tried to drown me. Then my dad came in the picture, and he adopted me and my sister. And the moment that he adopted me and my sister, my biological father came back in the picture and said, oh, I love them so much, I want them back, right? And that didn't happen. So he threatened to abduct us. And for the first decade of my life, I grew up with the fear of my parents that we would be abducted, that we would be kidnapped, and also with these codes. If we were home alone, we weren't allowed to open the door unless it was the doorbell rang in a certain code, or we weren't allowed to pick up the phone unless we had a special code for that. So my ability to be a kid, to be playful, to be and wander off into the woods, of course I did that, and it was met with so much fear on my parents' side, because every time I was late for dinner or whatever, they were afraid that I was being kidnapped. So that made my world very small. That's part of how I came to be in this world, right? Now, nothing has meaning until we give it meaning. And I made all that to mean that I wasn't worthy of love, that I wasn't worthy of being here, that I wasn't worthy of taking up space. And the theme of this conference is masculinity and relationships. And the way that I shaped my relationships is that I was 29 years old, and I realized that I'd been in a couple of relationships. Each of them had a poor ending that, if I looked back, was very similar. And the common denominator was me. It had nothing to do with the women I was dating. I was dating the same woman over and over again. But I was the guy who was the common denominator of that. And so at age 29, my sister actually called a family meeting. And she said, and my sister's 2 years older, we share the same biological father. And she shared, look, I'm really struggling with some things in life. I'm going through a burnout right now. And I realized that it has everything to do with the fact that my biological father didn't want me. And so I have all these feelings of, I'm not worthy of being here. And her bravery of calling that family meeting opened up what I call my pit of shit. Right? So my septic tank was overflowing, but I didn't realize because I had put a lid on it that was very tight. And her saying that just exploded that septic tank, or the pit of shit. That was the moment that I started going to therapy. And I got help from someone to deal with those issues. And there was a sense of urgency for me because I had met this lovely woman that I fell in love with, who happened to be in Chicago. And in the therapy that I did, I realized that I could go so far. There was a plateau that I had reached. I knew there was more there, but I just couldn't break through that part. And so I did the work that I needed. Then I moved over from the Netherlands to Chicago, which is where I'm living right now. And we got married, and I got into a massive depression. Like, if you hit a plateau like that and you decide to shake up your life completely, trust me, that plateau will break, right? Because everything that I was familiar with, I left in the Netherlands. I thought I knew that I was moving out of love. But here's what I thought. If I do something out of love, what can possibly go wrong? Let me tell you, a whole lot of things can go wrong, but I didn't realize that. So what went wrong for me was that I got into this massive depression. It took, I wasn't allowed to work in the United States. I'd been working since I was 16. So my sense of identity of being a man was that I worked, that I had income, and all that was gone. And although it was a conscious choice, it didn't feel good, right? And then in my sheer inability to express my emotions, to deal with my anger, instead of expressing that, I built it up, I kept it in. And then anger turns into fury. No, anger turns into rage. Rage turns into fury. And I punched a wall and I broke my hand. And whatever way you look at that, that's a sign of aggression, right? So not only did I break my hand, I also broke massive trust in my relationship. I love that you got your dogs here. That is so cool, James. They need attention. So by breaking my hand, I created a massive rift in the relationship that was already under strain because me being in a massive depression. What that did for me, though, is that was my rock bottom. So when people say the word rock bottom, the image that I have in my mind is you're a bouncing ball and you hit rock bottom and then you just bounce right up, right? My rock bottom was that I fell flat on my face. And did I get up? Sure, eventually. But first I needed to lay down there for a little bit. Then I needed to crawl before I could finally step up. And all that, I was in my pit of shit, right? So it didn't smell good. It didn't feel good. I was like, there was a lot of shame around it. But it was so important for me to be there because that was the beginning for me to get up, move forward, sit with all my demons, sit in that pit of shit. And my analogy is like when I'm in my pit of shit today is now I get to wiggle my toes and feel whatever is there. I get to take a deep whiff in and smell what I'm standing in, because the more that I just get familiar with where I'm at, the quicker that shit will dissipate and it'll get easier to move through, right? I can resist the heck out of it, which I'm also very good at. But then I just get to stay there longer. So from that perspective, I know what choices I am making today. So from the age of 29, when I realized that there were these patterns, I did some work on it. Then I moved to the United States and I started my relationship with my now ex-wife because we never recovered from the damage that I caused in those 3 years that depression lasted. We worked for it really hard, and in the last couple of years, we had an okay relationship, but we never recovered the trust and the passion that was there earlier, right? And we both agreed that we both deserved more than an okay relationship. At least that was my awareness, was that there are things that she needs from me that I will never be able to give. And there's things that I need from her that I will never be able to receive, or she will never be able to give. And we both deserve more. And so I made the decision to separate and then divorce. And we're still on speaking terms. We're still, like, she texted me yesterday, and there's still a lot of appreciation for each other. So a few things that, if I look back, so let me share, 29, when I started seeing a therapist for the first time, I was 41 when I finally healed that complex, if you will, of not being worthy. And in that time, there's a few things that happened. And this happened in January of 2019. That was the first time in 38 years that I had heard about my biological father. So for 38 years, he was not in the picture. And on the day that he reappeared is also the day that he died. So January of 2019, I got a call from my mom, and she shared, she's like, this person is back. He showed up in Chile at his paternal parents' house that is now, it was then inhabited by his half sibling. And she shared that he passed away. And for me, that was a massive, massive relief. You see, my biggest fear was that at a certain moment, someone was going to ring the doorbell. I would open up and someone would say, Andres, I'm your father. That wasn't scary. What was scary was that I would not be able to contain my rage, beat the crap out of him, not kill him, beat the crap out of him, and then step over him and walk away in the same way that he'd walked away from me. Right? So there's both poetry and drama in that. Right? But the scary, scary, scary part was the anger. Because I grew up with this idea that it was not okay for me to experience anger, to feel anger, to be angry, right? My mother had been abused by my biological father as well. And so I grew up, every time that I was angry, my mom would tell me this phrase. She would say, you have no reason to be angry, now change your facial expression. We talked about that decades later, and she said that's probably the biggest mess up that she created. That's what she told me. And I said, yep, you're probably right about that, right? Because it wasn't a healthy message. But that's how I grew up. So I wasn't comfortable with my own anger. And that day, when I found out that my biological father had passed away, I felt anger in the depth of my soul. I felt it in my gut, right? The underbelly, if you will. But here's the thing. I felt anger without being angry. Big difference. I felt anger, and for 3 days, nobody messed with me. Not that anyone would typically mess with me, but this time it was different. Like people would go away, right? I was radiating something that said, do not mess with me. And it was powerful. And so for the first time in my life, at age 41, I experienced anger. And anger is not good or bad. It just is. Just like the other emotions, anger is not good or bad, but it is a powerful source of energy. So I was at that moment still working with a therapist. Love the guy. And he's got a background in martial arts. And we had done some physical work, some somatic work together. And I reached out to him. I found out that my biological father died on Saturday. On Tuesday, 8 p.m., I had an appointment with him. I emailed him on Tuesday morning. I said, John, I'm experiencing all this anger. I need to do something physical. And so I checked in at 8 p.m. We sat down in his office. It was talking therapy. So this was a normal office. He said, you emailed me this morning. Do you still want to do something physical? I said, yep, I do. He's like, great. Wait a couple minutes. The business right next door to him was a personal training studio. And so he got the key and we went there. We'd never done this before, right? So we went there and there was one of these big tires that were, the big tractor tires that you use for personal training. I helped him put it on the floor. First, he gave me a sledgehammer. I start pounding that thing. Then he gave me boxing gloves and I start punching and talking. And then all of a sudden, he looks at me, he says, get in the bathtub. And he points at that big tire that now all of a sudden turned into a bathtub. And I was scared shitless. Sorry for all my swearing, but I was scared shitless. And he talked me through him. I trust him. And so I sit in the bathtub. I still have my boxing gloves on. And what I got to do was that I punched my way out of that bathtub in a way that I'd never been able to do as a kid. So I regained the power, and it was a powerful experience in that moment. I regained that power that I didn't have as a kid, and it was incredible. That same session, he asked me, he's like, you're carrying weight that isn't yours. How much of the weight that is not yours are you carrying? And I said, 100%, like all of it, right? So I've got my own 200 pounds, and I've got an additional 200 pounds. He says, great. And he grabs one of those big ropes that you use to, I don't know what you call that, like the big ropes. And he says, tie this around your waist. And he was holding on to that rope. And he said, I'm your biological father. I will never let go of you. And your job is to get free from me. And for the first 45 seconds that we were doing that, I was walking around this personal training studio, and I felt that I was winning because I was moving forward. That's the analogy to my life up on that point. I had this massive weight of 200 pounds behind me that I was just moving forward, and I thought I was winning because I was making progress, right? And then I remember this as that he started verbally abusing me, which I don't think he actually did, but that's what it felt like, because he repeated those same words. I'm your biological father. I will never let go of you. And then I felt the anger again. And in this moment, I didn't care if I killed the guy, but he was not going to be like holding on to me in that way. And so I made more progress. I took up the speed. I tried to throw him into the wall. That didn't work. There was a pillar here. I tried to throw him into the pillar. That didn't work. And I step in the bathtub, over the bathtub. He trips. And finally, I am free of that weight. The breakdown that I had in that moment was massive. It's such a powerful somatic experience that I had of letting go of that weight, and the symbolism of that was insane. And incredibly powerful. The other experience, so a little sidestep, a month or two later, I sit down with John again. We had been meeting regularly, but a month or two later, we sit down. He says, I want to start our session by sharing something with you. And he's like, I've decided to move from Chicago to Taos, New Mexico to do equine assisted therapy. And he said, part of the experience that you and I had made me realize that I am done with sitting down and doing this talk therapy in a couch. And I want to do something physically with my clients. I'm like, cool. And he invited me. He's like, whenever you want to go, come visit me in Taos. And both because you're a coach, but also I think would be very healing for you. And so in May of 2019, I went to Taos, New Mexico, and I spent a day and a half on this ranch, which is amazing. And I worked with 3 different horses, and I'll go to horse number 3, although these 2 are lovely as well. But horse number 3, his name is Cisco, and Cisco was 4 months old when he was nearly trampled to death by his father. So you can see the parallels in the story between Cisco and me. And Cisco, I worked with Cisco. Actually, Cisco doesn't like people. So you can't really get close to Cisco because he starts biting. So this was on the second day that I was there, and John, my therapist, said, go meditate in front of Cisco and just see what comes up. And I did that. And I had this awareness, whether it's true or not, I really don't know, but that Cisco bites people because he's used to being told off. And so it's easier for him to initiate that than to have the unexpected experience of being told off. I had some other realizations, and the way that this equine assisted therapy works in that context, or with John, I'm sure that there's many other ways, is that I did some work with Cisco, with the horse, and then John and I debriefed afterwards. And in that debrief, he asked me the same question. He said, how much of the weight that you're carrying right now is not yours? And I said, 1/3. He said, I think it's time that you let go of that. And he invited Ruth, which is the owner of the ranch, and they took me to this little part in the ranch where they have mementos for the horses that passed away. And there's 2 trees that create shadow, and in the trees there are ribbons. And the ribbons are for things that we are grateful for. And so Ruth invited me to cut off a piece of ribbon from the ribbons that she had brought, and to tie a ribbon in the tree. And this is the first time in my life that I was able to wish my biological father well, wherever he might be. I cried like a baby. I let go of so much in that moment, because up until that moment, I was harboring so much anger towards him, right? And in that moment, I tied that ribbon, and I shared the prayer of Saint Francis, which is one of my favorite prayers. And the release, the letting go, coming to acceptance and understanding that he didn't try to kill me, right? I just happened to be a kid who happened to be in the way, playing a role in his life, but it wasn't anything personal about me, right? He was just a guy who really struggled with expressing his emotions or with doing something with whatever, like that physical experience that comes up when we feel emotions and the label that we put on them. And he took it out on me, but it could have been anyone else. And so my message, what I'm taking away is what I see, and now I'm going to take this bigger than just me, is I see a lot of men today who are confused about what it means to be a man, and particularly in Western world, right? So Western Europe, the United States. And I think one of the convictions is that as men, we're not supposed to have emotions. And if we have them, we're not supposed to share them. Maybe with the exception of anger. Anger is okay to express, right? But you just heard my story. For me, it was not okay to express anger. And I think there's a number of reasons why we're confused, and I'll go deeper into that in a little bit. But we are doing a massive, massive disservice to our boys and girls today by not having men be comfortable with their emotions, by not having the fraternization, the camaraderie that used to exist. And I'll speak more about that in a little bit. Because to Craig's point earlier, we're missing the example about what it means to be a man in today's day and age. And I think that's part of the confusion. I have experienced personally what it means to be fathered by someone who was clueless to what it meant to be a father, to be a man, because his father had passed away when he was 11. My dad, who earned the title dad, that's a whole different story. He's a political refugee and experienced trauma by being tortured by the military in the country where he was from, and that's why he became a political refugee. From both my mom's side and my dad's side, I got the message that men are not safe. And I think that is what it is. But that's part of my work, is to create that camaraderie with men, because there's nothing unsafe necessarily about men, right? But how it is that we relate to each other determines whether it's safe or not. What I want to go, I can take this in a slightly different direction, because I think there's another important part to all of this. Something that is really key, and okay, I'm going to go there. The theme of today is masculinity and relationships, right? What I see, what I used to be, was this modern man who treats women with respect. And as a result of that, I completely missed the fact that once I have consent, once there is trust, and once there is intimacy, that I am allowed to bring my full animalistic lust desires into the bedroom. It was impossible for me to do that because there's a part of me that was really shut off from that. One, it was not okay for me to want what I want, so I was disconnected from that, and part of that came from my biological father rejecting me. I had made that to mean that I wasn't worthy. And so it was easier for me not to know what I wanted because I wasn't worthy of getting it either way, right? So there's a lot of healing that I needed to do there. That had to do with everything in my life: career, sex, gifts, what do I want to eat, all those type of things. right? And so I think a lot of men are confused to what it means to be a man in today's day and age. Part of that shows up in the bedroom, right? I've had partners who say, I want to be spanked, and I have absolutely no problem in doing that today, right? But 5 years ago, that would have been different, right? So there is this whole weird dynamic that goes on there, and we could probably do a whole summit on that. But I wanted to touch on that because I think it's an important part about masculinity and relationships, right? I also said that I was going to share why it is that I think that men are confused to what it means to be a man. And I think there's a few things. Before the Industrial Revolution, we as men used to work closely together with our fathers. And we could smell each other. We would be in each other's energy, and we would see how they would handle conflict, how they would resolve the issues. They would see that there were frustrations. I think that's an important part. And whether that was a healthy and productive way of handling conflict or not, it's something that is incredibly important that happened. Obviously, the better role model you have, the better you turn out, the healthier you turn out as a guy. But after the Industrial Revolution, we saw dad getting up early, going to work. That's my experience. My dad would wake up before I would wake up, and he would come home late. And so I have an older sister and a mom. After I would come home from school, the majority of the day I would interact with them. And so I would learn what it means to be a man from the two women in my life and not from my dad. I think that's one part that is an issue in today's day and age. The other part is, in different cultures, it still occurs today, and in former or in older parts of Western culture, there was a rite of passage of how you go from boy to becoming a man. And in my mind, I have this romantic view of it means getting together around the fire. And whether it is at the age that the boy first ejaculates, 12, 13, and there's that rite of passage. I know that in South America, sometimes it's at age 7. But they would be invited to the group of men, and there they would listen to how the elders would share their frustrations, their problems, how they would resolve conflict, right? They would see that there is frustration, but there would also be a safe space where they could hash that out. Now, with the rise of women in the workforce, which I think is a great thing, right? What men lost there was this space outside of the home where they could connect and fraternize and talk about certain things. And I think that's a key part that plays into this idea that men are not supposed to have emotions, because our women don't want to see us struggle. And yes, we struggle, right? And so what we're missing is this safe space where we can hash out those frustrations, the conflict, etc. To be very clear, I think feminism is important. I think the rise of women into the workforce is important. I'm not saying anything to devalue that. The point that I am making is that in that, men have lost something, right? And we can argue that, right? Just want to make crystal clear that I think it's nothing against, right, women in the workforce. I think that is the reason why, or a number of reasons why I see men struggling or confused to what it means to be a man in today's day and age. And I've shared my own story about, my own experience with that. I'll gladly take any comments, questions that you guys have.
So now, if you could summarize, okay, the 3 key things that enabled you to go from that child that was almost drowned in the bath, okay, to where you are right now. If you could summarize in 3 key points, what would you say they are?
The first one is get help, right?
Okay.
And maybe help is not the right word, but get the support that you need, right? I am right now, I can tell you that what my biological father did to me, it happened, right? It defined me. Well, it shaped me, but it doesn't have to define me, right? But I needed support to process through all of that. So that's one. I needed to get the right support. The second thing was I had to learn to feel my feelings all the way through to completion. And that is what I help with my clients with right now. If there's one thing that I do with all of them, it's a simple six-step exercise where I help them to feel their feelings, knowing that feelings come up, they reach their peak, and then they dissipate. And if we allow ourselves to feel our feelings all the way through to completion, there is wisdom or insight at the other side of that. And so I needed to learn to trust the wisdom of my body. We have 3 or 4 centers of wisdom: our head, our heart, our gut, and our reproductive organs. And getting in touch with that information of what our body is trying to tell us has been absolutely key. And I used to live my life from my head on up, right? I was very comfortable with living my life from this part, but that is not living my life fully, right? There's a whole part that was disconnected. I shared earlier, right? You need the rest of this part if you want to have a good sexual experience, right? That doesn't happen here. Part of it happens here, but the majority of it happens below. So getting connected and feeling my feelings all the way through completion is number 2. Number 3 is talking about it, right? I had to be open with my now ex-wife and say, hey, this is what's going on. And it's challenging because she grew up in a household that was male dominated. Her dad was COO of a very large company, 2 older brothers. And I came as a sensitive guy into that relationship. And part of that she was attracted to. But part of that, when I would share, she would also say, you're too fucking sensitive. Right? And so it wasn't safe for me to share. And yet that's what I needed to do. I needed to open up and say, regardless of what you think of me, this is where I stand, and you can judge it, feel free to judge it, but this is my truth. And so I had to get comfortable with my own truth and owning my truth, and then open up towards her and say, you can judge me, you can reject me, right? But my truth is not going to change. That doesn't mean I'm not open to a conversation about it. But if you deny what I'm feeling, right? If you're saying you're not feeling that, cool, but that's your stuff. And I had to come to terms with that part. Thank you for asking that. So it's acceptance is the third part in one word.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it, man.
Sure thing. Any other questions? Reflections?
I would be really interested to hear what the other rites of passages were for the men on this call, because literally every single man on this call right now is from a different country, a different continent.
Can I share what I believe my rite of passage was?
I would love to hear your rite of passage.
My rite of passage, sure, and sure, there may have been several, but I think the most important one for me happened 2 years ago, and I'm 42 now. And it's when I sat down with my dad, the person who earned the title dad, and we had a conversation about what happened to him while he was in the resistance, when he was arrested, and how he was tortured. And he had never talked about that. We knew it had happened. I knew that it had happened, but I never had heard from him what exactly had transpired. And for him to sit down with me on my request, I asked about it. And him to open up with me was, I think, my rite of passage, where he trusted me. And I'll be honest, I lost a little bit of faith in humanity that day when I heard what had happened to him. But I also think that's when he allowed me in a way that he had never done before.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Andreas. And then we have an interesting flip side of things, because we have Calvin from the military, and James, you have a history with gangs, which also, I imagine has its own interesting rite of passage, if you're interested and willing to share any part of that.
Yes, Andres, as I was been listening to your talk, it's been making me think about my relationship with my dad and he was military in the Army during Vietnam. And so he has or had a lot of trauma in his life in regards to that. I shared on the last men's summit, but I don't want to get into it too much here. I'll wait for tomorrow to share. And that affected me in a way that I was seeking to get that approval of that I can do it. And I didn't get that sense until I went through survival school, SEER training for the Air Force back in 1992. It was a 6-week program where we had to learn how to deal with being tortured. How do you learn to survive in enemy territory and get away? How do you protect yourself? How do you get to an extraction point? How do you hide? All types of things. And at the end of that process, I had learned that I had the ability and I could make it. I could do it. That was the rite of passage that I went through. On the opposite of that, of what your dad had gone through. They taught me how to deal with having to go through that process. So that's what I took away for myself. The ability that I had learned the most important basic needs as a man, that I have what it takes to take care of myself, regardless of what situation I'm in.
Powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Calvin.
Thanks, guys, for sharing. I would have to say very similar to Calvin, but the training ground was actually the streets. And it was live. There was no practice. It was like do or die, him or me, and basically who pulled first won kind of thing. So it was a lot of learning. When I was 17, I committed a crime. My girlfriend, she had ended up forging a check from her father for $1,000. Came to me to cash it. It was the girlfriend of the captain of the football team, and the captain of the football team was my arch enemy amongst many other football players. We were the skater punks, and we fought with them consistently. So I didn't want to lose the girl. Good kid, bad choice. Cashed the check, got away with it. 2 weeks went by, felt like a man, had the girl, partied, and then she came back with a $10,000 check a couple weeks later. Took me about a week to make the bad decision, to do this. And, I was a good student. I was a great artist. I was on my way to Formula One racing school in Montreal. I had just won the Myrtle Beach Grand Prix Formula 2000, so I won a scholarship. So obviously bad choice to get involved in crime in that way. Ended up doing it. Father and the police were waiting for me. And even though being convicted or charged as a young juvenile 17-year-old, I was convicted as an adult on my 18th birthday. So my rite of passage was the murder capital prison, the largest, most violent prison in Canada, in London, Ontario, which is actually the city that I'm from, on my 18th birthday. So pretty much the stuff that I had to go through there to not necessarily prove that I was a man, be a man at 18, and survive it all, and to now come out and share those experiences and look back at it and see that was my passage that allowed me to now share with youngsters that I choose to serve, which are, good kids that have made some bad choices, that are involved in gangs and street life and drugs and alcoholism, etc. But I definitely look back at those first 3 months of my adulthood in prison, coming from some pretty rough streets, definitely wake you up and grow you up pretty fast. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that, James. It's really powerful. Joe, Katie, Johanna, if you'd like to chip in about your experiences, that would be lovely. If not, no worries whatsoever. Just want to keep that open offer for you. Just go ahead and unmute yourself if you wanted to. And if
So
not,
there's something that stood out to me, James, in your story, and it's a choice of words. And it's, I was 18 years old and I needed to prove that I was a man, and not only prove it, but also be a man. And so just in the language there, there's this idea that you being born with a penis was not enough to be a man, right? You still needed to prove it. And I think there's a lot of that going on, where it's this idea of you're not man enough, or which I think is incredibly damaging, right? And yet there's something healthy about just pushing each other up and having some rivalry there, right? But this idea of I needed to prove that I was a man and be a man, that struck me.
Very similar language too, though. Boys don't cry, you know, suck it up, buttercup. You know, the worst thing you can say to a boy is be a man. You know, cutting his boyhood short, his childhood years short. Very, very unfair to any young lad. I come from a Central European background, German background. My parents had gone through the war as well. My father, all the men on the male side, they lost their lives in Russia, in Stalingrad. So to have that experience, and then being born into an Anglo-Saxon, English, British city as a German boy, going through that, you know, that black spot on the German people's history, you know, being pretty much crucified politically from being a very young boy onward, just because of the nature of my cultural background, and having to learn that and understand that and how to navigate through that and around that and embrace that and still love my culture and my people is quite a journey, you know. So that added on top of, you know, gang life and, you know, being thrown into situations where your life is in jeopardy and at risk, both sides, family side and street friend side, constantly attempting to prove that you're a man, and to constantly one up everything and everybody. And, you know, it's an alpha environment, both sides of the fence. And if you're not that role, you're less than, and it's just not appropriate, and it's not accepted to be less than in either environment, unfortunately.
Thank you for sharing that. It's a powerful perspective and reality for so many.
Yes. Yeah. One that's not really talked about, because it's the victors that write the history books.
yeah. Well, thank you so very much, James and Calvin and Stephen, everybody, for being here. Andreas, we have a couple minutes to wrap up, my friend. Is there anything else that you would like to say? There's so much there.
I feel complete. I am honored to have been here and share my story. I understand that that parts of it are traumatic. I preface that. If there's anything that anyone wants to share around that, feel free, either message me privately or share here.
Thank you so much, Andreas, again, for being here and for vulnerably sharing your story. And it's a privilege, as always, to be able to connect.
My pleasure and my honor.
Thank you.